Indonesia, the giant, the center of the whole regional pitch, now raises less venture money. A bubble this size is never just one person's fault. It is a whole system agreeing not to look too closely. I told you the funds were not saints, and I mean it. The markup game, the fee game, all of it. I've called the VC industry and these tactics a grift. My industry earned plenty of the anger coming its way. But there is a very large gap between you pumped your paper numbers to raise a bigger fund and you belong in prison cell because a startup failed. The bubble burst, the hammer came down, the rules tightened, and the smart early money did the only rational thing. It left. It stopped writing early checks there. For about a decade, Indonesia was the story. Not a story, the story. The biggest market in Southeast Asia, 280 million people, most of them young, most of them coming online for the first time with a phone in their hand, Gojek, Tokopedia, a parade of unicorns. Every global fund with a Southeast Asia slide had Jakarta at the center of it. This was going to be the next great growth story on Earth, and everybody wanted in. Now, I want to give you one number that tells you where that story is now. In 2021, at the peak, Indonesian startups raised about $6.9 billion by themselves. Not the region, Indonesia. Last year, 2025, the whole country raised 355 million. That is roughly 5 cents on the dollar as before. Indonesia, the giant, the center of the whole regional pitch, now raises less venture money than Vietnam. The music has stopped, the bubble burst, and here is what I actually want to talk about today because the burst is not the only interesting part. Bubbles burst everywhere. What is interesting is what comes next. And in Indonesia, 3 things arrived at once. The courts came for the founders, the regulators came for the funds, and the smart money quietly started packing its bags. That is the reckoning. So let's walk through it. I'm Kevin Brockland. This is Sea of Startups, real, raw, relatable. Let's get into it. So before we bury this thing, we have to be honest about how it got so big in the first place, because a bubble this size is never just one person's fault. It is a whole system agreeing not to look too closely. Here is how the boom actually worked. And I'm going to be honest about my own side of the table because that is the only way that this ends up being fair. You back a startup, 6 months later, 12 months later, 18 months later, another fund puts money in, hopefully at a higher price. And just like that, on your books, your stake is worth more. You have made money on paper. You did not sell anything. You did not return a cent to anyone, but the number on your page went up. And that paper number is the single most valuable thing you own because it is what you carry into the room when you go to raise your next fund, a bigger fund. And a bigger fund pays you a bigger management fee in cash. This year, whether or not 1 rupiah, $1 of that paper gain ever turns real. So let me say the quiet part plainly. These funds spent years marking their own books up to prices that only lived on paper, because that paper is what raises a bigger fund and pays a bigger fee. Every asset class on earth plays that game. Private equity plays it, hedge funds play it, real estate plays it. Indonesia's only bad luck for the venture ecosystem was that here the bubble actually burst. So everyone found out at once. And when everyone marks everything up, nobody wants to be the person who checks. When eFishery was carried on everyone's books at unicorn prices, every investor holding it got to waive that markup at their own backers and raise more. The number made everyone more money on paper. So who exactly was going to drive out to the fish farms and count the feeders, like we talked about last week? Nobody did. That is how a balloon gets this big. Real founders, real ambition, a genuinely enormous market, all of that was true. But wrapped around it was this thick layer of paper valuation that everyone had a reason to believe and nobody had a reason to test. And then the cheap money went away. Global interest rates went up. The free-flowing capital dried up. And the next round, at a higher price, simply stopped coming. And the moment the markup stopped going up, the whole thing had to be repriced down to what was actually there. As Buffett would say, when the tide rolls out, you can see who is swimming naked. And it seems like many were. And as I say, that is when you find out what was actually there. And sometimes it is a smaller real business. And sometimes it turns out there was nothing there at all. But here is the time when you have to justify the valuations and the underlying intrinsic value. Now, here is what a burst bubble does. It's a slow decline. It exposes everything. It's not a slow decline that never does. It exposes everything. The tide goes out and you see who is swimming without a suit. And in Indonesia, when the tide went out, the state did not shrug. It reached for a hammer. Start with the clearest case, eFishery. The internet-connected fish feeder company that we've talked about in the past, claimed as the future of aquaculture, turned out to be one of the biggest frauds this region ever produced. We've talked about this. The company claimed it had made $752 million in revenue. Real number was nowhere close. It claimed a profit. It was actually losing tens of millions. 2 sets of books. Hammer comes down. The founder was sentenced to 9 years. On appeal last week, that came down to 6, but you also saw 2 of his executives going to prison alongside him. And the investors who got fooled were not amateurs. Many sophisticated players, but nonetheless. Then we have Investree, a fintech lender, one of the, at the time, respected pioneers, run by a genuine star of the Indonesian finance. The regulator says he collected around $160 million from the public without the license to do it and routed it through shell companies. When the investigation closed in, seems like he fled to Qatar. They chased him down with an Interpol notice, extradited him, and he landed back in Jakarta in handcuffs. He is facing up to 10 years. So far, this is a clean story. Frauds exposed, frauds punished. Good. If that were the whole thing, I would be telling you the cleanup is working. But the hammer didn't stop at the frauds. And this is where it gets bit heavier. We move on to the other part. There was a startup called Tani Hub, an agri-tech connecting farmers to buyers. It failed the way startups fail. Two investors had put about $25 million in MDI Ventures and BRI Ventures. And here's the detail that changes everything. Because MDI is owned by Telkom Indonesia, BRI Ventures is owned by Bank BRI. Both parents are state owned. So, in the eyes of the law, the money that went up in smoke was state money. And in Indonesia, a loss of state money can be prosecuted as corruption. The man who ran Tani Hub, Ivan Sustiawan, actually did divert funds for himself. It was a fraud. He got 9 years, and that is, according to the court records, a thief getting what a thief gets. But then the court turned to the investors, and it convicted them too. You saw Donald Wiharja, former chief executive of MDI Ventures, 5 years. Nico Wijaja, former chief executive of BRI Ventures, 3 years. Two more investment executives, 2 years each. Four venture capitalists in prison for backing a company that failed. And I want to be precise because this is the part that made, a lot of the investors that I know in and outside of the region sit up. The court record noted there was no personal gain. These men did not seemingly steal. What they were convicted of was approving an investment that lost money. Their own defense was the most basic rule in all of investing, especially in venture, that a decision made in good faith that happens to lose money is not a crime. It is just the risk associated with that investment. Seems like the court did not accept it, considering the outcome. Now, I told you the funds were not saints, and I mean it. The markup game, the fee game, all of it. I've called the VC industry and these tactics a grift. My industry earned plenty of the anger coming its way. But there is a very large gap between you pumped your paper numbers to raise a bigger fund and you belong in prison cell because a startup failed. The hammer stopped drawing a distinction, it seems. It came down on the thieves, great, and the losers with roughly the same force. You started a company to build a product, not to run a back office. But here you are. You pay an accounting firm every month, and once a year, you get a clean set of accounts. That is compliance. It's not clarity. It will not tell you if you run out of cash in March. It will not tell you what one new hire does to your runway. And it will not answer the question every investor asks. Where's this business heading? So I built your CFO, your back office in a box. Your books keeps your accounting books current, and your CFO puts your forecast forward. In one login, your actuals flowing straight into your outlook. Link your strategic initiatives, like a hire or a price change, to exactly what it does to your runway before you commit. Investor ready, operationally ready, in the currency that you work in. It is the back office I run across my own companies. Get your finances settled for your business today at yourcfo.tech. That's yourcfo.tech. And it reached the very top also. Many have commented on the story of Nadim Makaram, co-founder of Gojek, former Minister of Education. At the time, Gojek is the most successful startup founder this country had seen. Last month, 10 years. And I'm going to be exact because it matters. He was not convicted of enriching himself from what I read. The court seemed to specifically find that he did not. The conviction was for abuse of authority and how his ministry bought school laptops and for favoring Google, which had been an early Gojek investor. He says the deal saved money. He is appealing. We'll see what happens with it. I don't want to opine on guilt or other laws. The only thing that I can talk about is perceptions from the outside world. And anything other that is for the appeal. But think about the picture here. The founder who built the country's proudest tech company is now in a cell. The two founders who faked and fled are in cells, and four investors who simply lost money are in cells too. That is the hammer. And whatever you think of any single case, the message that lands on every founder and every fund in the country is the same. When the boom turns to a bust here, the bust does not end in a spreadsheet and red ink. It can end in a courtroom. Do that mental math on the risk associated with being there in the first place. And once the courtroom is in play, the regulator is never far behind, because the other thing a burst bubble triggers, always, everywhere, is new rules. The people who missed the fraud on the way up are often desperate to look tough on the way down. So, the financial regulator, OJK, brought in a new regime for venture firms. You now need 50 billion rupiah, or about $3 million in paid up capital, just to operate a fund. Use your license within 6 months or lose it. Full disclosure of who really owns and controls you. Now, some of that is as a reasonable reaction. After Investree ran money through shell companies, wanting to know who actually controls a fund, I understand the intent. But to be honest about the $3 million floor actually it doesn't stop the next fraud. Fraud does not care about what your paid up capital is. What it may do is price out the emerging fund managers, the exact people a recovering market needs most, the ones willing to back a founder before anyone else will. You do not catch the crook. You just clear the room of the honest small players. And it is not only the private market. Up at the level of the public stock exchange, MSCI, the firm whose indices steer trillions of dollars of passive money around the world, has put Indonesia under review. We've talked about this in prior episodes. It flagged the market for opacity, for murky shareholding, for suspected coordinated trading. It has pushed the review out to November, and it is holding open the option of downgrading Indonesia from an emerging market to a frontier market. Now, I want to be careful. It has not downgraded Indonesia. It is under review. But if that downgrade comes, the estimates are that as much as $13 billion could flow straight back out of the country, almost mechanically, as the passive funds rebalance away based upon those allocations and those indices. So stack it up. At the startup level, investors going to prison. At the fund level, small players regulated out of existence. And at the public market level, the world's biggest index provider standing at the exit with a hand on the switch. Every rule, every review, every sentence is pointing the same direction. And the people who move capital for a living, they can read a compass. Which brings me to the last piece, and the quietest, and the one that tells you where this is actually going. A few days ago, news story breaks that Ventures, one of the more known names in the region, uh, restructured. It shut its Indonesia office, pulled its team back to Singapore, and said it is moving upmarket towards later, safer growth stage deals. No scandal, no sentence, no headline number, just a flagship fund quietly closing its door in Jakarta and walking back across the causeway, walking back across towards home base in Singapore, and sitting next to everything else in this episode that is not a coincidence. It is the logical last step. The bubble burst, the hammer came down, the rules tightened, and the smart early money did the only rational thing. It left. It stopped writing early checks there. Now, this may not be the last fund to make that move. It is just the most recognizable name as of so far. So let me be clear about where I actually land, because I do not want this to sound like doom, and I do not want it to sound like a defense of my own industry. The frauds deserve everything they get. Gibran, Adrian, the man who looted Tani Hub, no sympathy. Throw the book. Fraud is fraud and should be punished. And my own industry earned a hard look for the years it spent inflating paper it knew was soft. A reckoning was coming, and a lot of it is fair. But there is a difference, in my view, between a reckoning that cleans a market and a reckoning that empties it. Right now, Indonesia might be doing both at the same time, and it does not seem as if there's a difference known. It is punishing the fraud, which is right, and it is frightening off the risk, which is fatal, and it is doing them in the same breath. Now, mind you, my own fund, we hadn't invested in Indonesia intentionally because I had said for a while that the values were inflated. And I think that is an important part to link to it. But that bubble is now burst. And here is a part worth holding on to, because you do not walk away thinking the country is finished, because it is not. It is still the biggest market in this region. It still is the largest population, and it still is filled with people who want to build and buy and grow. And remember, something like 90% of that peak money was foreign to begin with. So a lot of what just fled was never really part of this region or part of that country. The people are still there. The demand is still there. What left was a lot of the money bought in on the story and the honestly fake valuations. And some of that just needed to go or needed to recalibrate. The question is whether, when the dust settles, anyone with capital is still willing to stand in the room and take a real risk on a Jakarta founder. Right now, they are heading for the door. The market that figures out how to call them back, that is the one that wins the next decade. So that is the show. If you are a founder in Jakarta watching your funding options walk out one by one, or an investor deciding whether to stay, I do want to hear from you. I read every reply. I'm Kevin Brockland. This has been Sea of Startups, real, raw, relatable. The tide went out on Indonesia. Now we have to see who is still willing to swim. I'll see you next week. And that does it for this episode of Sea of Startups. If you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, please give it a like, give it a review, subscribe to our channel. A little bit of feedback goes a long way in allowing us to keep on putting out these kind of episodes.